The county man had tagged it years ago, but the red tag was still legible enough to read from 3 feet away. Dry, Phil recommended. It hung on a length of wire looped around the well cap, faded but not gone, and Calvin Mercer stood beside it in the heat of an August afternoon while a banker and a neighbor waited for him to say something. "Calvin," the banker said, "the county marked it dry. I can't lend against a dry hole." Wayne, the neighbor, leaned against his truck with his arms crossed. "Your father kept that hole because he hated admitting a thing was done." Calvin looked past both of them, out toward the pond behind the barn, down to a ring of cracked mud where water used to sit deep enough to swim a calf. "Dad said it came back before morning," he said, quiet enough that Wayne had to lean in to catch it. Wayne laughed, not cruelly, just certain the way men get certain about things they've stopped questioning. "Then maybe borrow from the morning." The county had tested the well when men were awake. Calvin decided to test it when the farm was quiet. If stories about old wells, old habits, and the patience it takes to read either one belong to your kind of channel, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. It was August of 1988. In hill country along the Missouri-Kentucky line, one of the driest Augusts the county had seen in decades. Calvin was 46, and he had come back to the 58-acre farm the winter before, after his father died, to take over ground he had grown up on but never expected to run alone. 22 acres of rough pasture, 14 of lower hay ground, 9 of cedar and brush, 6 acres of rocky slope, an old barn, and a pond that was down to mud. Calvin had spent years working at a feed mill and a repair shop in town before coming home, and most of the county still thought of him as the quiet Mercer boy who had come back to sit on his father's ground out of grief more than sense. He was not a man people expected quick answers from, and he had never much minded that reputation. In conversations at the sale barn or the feed store, he tended to let other men finish their point twice before he offered his own, and more often than not, he said nothing at all. It made him easy to talk past, easy for a banker to explain a decision to rather than discuss it with. Calvin had learned to let that happen without much complaint. He had also learned, from his father, that being slow to answer and being slow to understand were two different things entirely. He held 31 cows, 24 of them cow-calf pairs he could not afford to lose before fall sale. The banknote was due to be settled against that calf check. A drilled well, by the only quote he had, would cost $9,800 once pump and wiring were figured in. Hauling water at the going summer rate would run $42 a day, a cost that added up fast against a farm already stretched thin. The bank was not interested in extending the operating line to cover either one. Without proof, the ground could carry water on its own. The old stone well near the smokehouse had sat abandoned so long that most people in the county had stopped counting it as anything at all. It was a stop on the old lane, the kind of feature every hill farm carried somewhere on the property and eventually forgot about once a modern well or a good pond made it unnecessary. Calvin's father had used the well now and then over the years, in a way nobody else in the family had paid close attention to, and the only thing he had ever said about it, more than once, was a line Calvin had heard so many times he'd stopped hearing it. That well never gave much by daylight, but it came back before morning. At the feed store that week, the talk ran the way it usually did. Dry means dry. A bucket at dawn doesn't make a water system. If that well worked, your father would have used it. County tagged it for a reason. One man, leaning against the counter with his coffee, put it plainer than the rest. A slow well is just a dry well with manners. Calvin did not argue any of it. He drove home and lowered a bucket into the well that same evening. It came up with a few inches of muddy water in the bottom, barely enough to wet the sides. Wayne, passing by on the road, saw him standing over it and did not bother stopping to say anything. The look on his face said enough. Calvin went back before sunrise the next morning, before the farm had stirred, before the heat of the day had settled back onto the ground, walking out with a flashlight still in hand because the sky had not fully lightened yet. He lowered the bucket again. It came up nearly full. He stood there a moment holding it, not quite trusting it, before he carried it back to the house. He did not tell anyone. He wrote it down in a notebook he had started keeping since his father's funeral, mostly out of habit, a running record of everything on the place that needed watching. He measured it a second way the following day, marking a stick and lowering it down the shaft to check the water level directly, the same method his father had used decades earlier, by the look of faded pencil marks still visible on a stick kept hanging in the smokehouse. At 6 in the evening, the level sat low, barely covering the bottom stones. At 4:45 the next morning, it had risen well above where it had been the night before, high enough that the stick came up wet nearly to his hand. On the third day, he drew exactly 5 gallons out with the hand crank and waited an hour before checking again, timing it against his watch to be sure he wasn't fooling himself. The water had not come back in that hour. It came back overnight, the same as before, slow and steady and entirely on its own schedule. The well was not refilling on the clock men usually checked. It was refilling on the clock nobody bothered to watch. The well was not dry. It was slow water nobody had waited long enough to measure. It did not take long for the well to make Calvin look wrong instead of right. The banker drove out one afternoon around 2 o'clock to see the proof for himself. Calvin lowered the bucket in front of him, and it came up carrying mostly bottom mud and a wet shine on the bucket's floor, nothing more. "That," the banker said, "is the county's whole argument." A few days later, hopeful and impatient, Calvin drew too much water too fast, hauling bucket after bucket up on a rope to fill a trough for a handful of thirsty calves, telling himself the well had proven it could give more than everyone thought. The well dropped hard and did not recover the way it had before, sitting low and stubborn for 2 full days no matter how early he checked it. Jonas Pike, an old well man Calvin had finally thought to call, told him plainly what he'd done when he came out to look. "You treat a slow well like a fast one," Jonas said. "You'll make a dry well out of it." Calvin's first attempt at storage failed just as badly. He set an open barrel under the well line to catch overflow, thinking gravity alone would be enough to solve the problem, but with no float valve to control it, the cattle pushed and crowded around the barrel until it tipped, turning the whole area into standing mud within a single afternoon. "Now the dry well has a mud hole," Wayne said, not unkindly, the next time he drove past. When Calvin brought his notebook into the bank to show the morning and evening measurements he'd been keeping, the banker looked it over for a moment and set it back down. "A notebook is not a pump test," he said. At home, his brother told him over supper that he ought to think about selling down the herd before the market got worse, that their father's old sayings about a well weren't going to count for anything with a banker. Calvin did not answer that directly. He kept getting up before sunrise and writing down what the bucket told him. Jonas Pike came back out the following week, this time with the intention of testing the well properly instead of letting Calvin guess at it. The old stone shaft ran down into a shallow seam of limestone, the kind of ground that held water the way a sponge does rather than the way a tank does, releasing it slowly through the rock rather than all at once. Pulled hard, it would drop and stay dropped for hours. Left alone, it would seep back in through the stone at its own pace. Jonas measured the static level in the evening, drew 10 gallons, checked the drawdown, checked recovery after 1 hour, and checked it again the next morning. He repeated the same routine for 7 straight days. The pattern held every time, slow but consistent. "It is not a big well," Jonas told him, looking down into the shaft. "It is a patient one. It did not fail because it had no water. It failed because men asked it for a day's water in 1 hour." Calvin worked out the numbers on a legal pad the way his father had taught him to before making any decision that cost money. A new drilled well would run $6,700 for the hole, another $2,150 for pump and wiring, and $950 more for tank and line, close to $9,800 total. Money the bank was not going to advance against unproven ground. Hauling water at $42 a day across a 58-day dry stretch would come to $2,436, not counting fuel and the hours lost every day to the drive. Selling 24 cow-calf pairs early under drought pressure into a market already softened by every other farmer doing the same thing would cost him roughly $85 a head against what he'd get holding to fall, a loss of about $2,040 before counting the weight the calves would lose being sold light. Restoring the well as a slow recovery system, by contrast, ran him $220 for Jonas's inspection, $160 to clean out old debris, $310 for a safe cap, $420 for a small low-flow pump to replace the old hand crank, $275 for a used storage tank, $155 for float valve and pipe, and $190 to fence the well off from the cattle. The total came to $1,730. The recovery test showed the well could deliver somewhere between 250 and 350 gallons into storage overnight if managed properly, closer to 500 to 700 gallons over a full day if nobody rushed it. Not enough to waste, enough with discipline to keep a controlled group of cattle watered through a dry season. The well could not save Calvin if he used it like a pond. It could save him if he used it like a clock. He built the system the way Jonas laid it out. He fenced the well itself so cattle could not crowd it directly. He fitted the safe cap and ran the small low-flow pump down into the shaft, plumbed to a storage tank set in shade near the old lane, controlled by a float valve so nothing would overflow and nothing would run dry from carelessness. He set a rotation for watering the herd in groups rather than turning everyone loose on the tank at once, and he made sure the cow-calf pairs got priority over the dry stock when water ran short. Calvin stopped asking the well to be strong. He asked it to be steady. By the first week of August, the drought had tightened its grip on the whole county. The pond behind Calvin's barn was nothing but a ring of cracked mud. The creek along the road had gone dry enough to walk across without wetting a boot. Neighbors were hauling water twice a day. Trucks lined up at the co-op's fill station before sunup, and the co-op in town had sold out of stock tanks by the second week of the month. One farm 2 roads over sold down its herd early after a pump pulled air and quit for good, the owner telling anyone who'd listen that he wasn't waiting around to see if the well would come back. Calvin's tank did not look impressive by daylight. It never filled fast enough to satisfy anyone watching at noon, and more than one man, driving past in the heat of the afternoon, would have sworn the whole setup was as dry as the county tag claimed. But every morning, before the sun came up, there was more water in it than there had been the evening before, enough to stretch his pasture rotation and keep his herd off the sale barn floor, while men around him were making decisions they didn't want to make. Wayne came by early one morning, expecting, by his own admission later, to catch Calvin at a failure worth talking about at the feed store. Instead, he found the tank fuller than it had been the afternoon before, water clear and steady, cattle already moving toward it in their turn. "Where was that yesterday afternoon?" Wayne asked. "Coming," Calvin said. When Calvin finally brought his case to the bank, he carried Jonas's recovery test, 7 days of morning and evening logs in his own notebook, receipts for the tank and pump and fence, his cattle count, and the math on hauling costs he had avoided simply by waiting for sunrise instead of giving up at noon. The banker looked it over for a long while before he spoke. "It still cannot carry expansion," he said. "I am not expanding," Calvin said. "Then what is it enough for?" "Not selling." The bank changed the language in its file from dry abandoned well to low-flow recoverable stock water with storage system. Nobody apologized for the tag that had hung on that well for years. Nobody needed to. Wayne stood by the well one morning not long after, looking at the faded red tag still hanging on its wire. "Your father knew?" he asked. "He knew it came back," Calvin said. Wayne studied the tag a moment longer. "Tag was wrong then." "Not wrong," Calvin said. "Incomplete. The county had not lied on purpose. At noon that well looked dry. A bucket dropped once would scrape mud. A man in a hurry would write the word and move on to the next place. Dry. Phil recommended. And for years everybody believed the tag because a tag is easier to read than a well. But wells do not all speak at the same speed. Some give water like a pond. Some give it like a pump. And some only answer after the farm has gone quiet and the sun has not yet come up. Calvin's father had known that. Calvin had almost forgotten it. The bank saw a dry hole. The county saw an old record, The neighbors saw a man waiting on nothing. But before sunrise, the bucket came up full. And in August, that was enough. If this is the kind of story you come back for, there's a subscribe button below, and we'd like to know where you're watching from. Would you call a well dry after one daytime test, or check it before sunrise?